Hey everybody, I'm going to share my custom project that I did. Um, just a quick presentation, starting at the top. So I decided to look at U.S. trade with partner countries, and then more specifically later on between specific states and specific partner countries. I thought it'd be an interesting project to do. I work in uh, international trade, and it was useful for my work, looking specifically at California UK trade, which I'll talk about a little later. And it's just good data to work with. It goes back a long ways and covers a lot of different topics. But starting with the top, I had to import this data from the US Census Bureau website. Initially, it comes in export and import columns. So I had to add those together to create a total column between all these different countries and regions, and their trade with the US. Then I wanted to look at top trade partners. I had to remove a lot of the regions because those weren't really relevant to my analysis. I wanted to just look at countries. So that was took a little bit of time to do some of that data cleanup. And then I wanted to look at the discrepancy between countries that traded large volumes with the US and those that traded smaller volumes. And by making this histogram here, you can see that most countries, almost all of them, trade under $100 billion a year with the US, and that's imports and exports. There's only a few outliers, about 7 that trade more than that. And those are going to be the really top countries, Canada, Mexico, China, Japan, and some of those others in that top bracket. So to break that down a little bit more and to look at some of the discrepancies within this group, I made the bins smaller, spaced them out more, but you can still see that a large amount of the US's trading partners are going to be smaller countries that don't trade that much with the US. They trade less than $100 million a year with the US, and some will be broken down into larger groups. But it really goes to show that the US does most of its trade with larger countries. And you can see that here. I broke that down as a percentage of total trade. Each country's trade is a percentage of the US's total trade volumes per year in 2021. And you can see, Canada, Mexico, and China, they make up about 14%. I should have multiplied this by 100, but about 14% of the US's total trade volume. And the rest is made up by smaller countries. You can see that in this histogram here. So those top 3 really have an outsized importance to the US's total trade, and then it just decreases less and less as you move on. And without the top 20 countries, actually, the rest of them, the rest of the 215 or whatever it is, make up only about 5% of US total trade. So I thought, that's kind of an interesting stat, whereas China, Mexico, and Canada make up about 42%, which is a huge amount. So it kind of shows a bit of global inequality there. So coming back to the top traders, I wanted to see how the top traders trade with the US has varied over time since 1985. So that's when the table started. I had to make a function to kind of reformat that table to make sure each column was a country, organized by years, and then plot that. So you can see on this graph here that the bottom 7, so this is the top 10 countries, bottom 7 have all kind of seen similar tracks and have increased kind of steadily, but not that much compared to the top 3. So Canada, Mexico, and China, you can see these huge increases, and they've really pulled away from the group. And now in 2021, those countries share about an equal amount of the US's trade volume, like I said, around 14%, but has largely outpaced the rest. Japan is the 4th, and I think they trade about 4 or 5% of the US's total trade volume. You can see there's huge differences there. And over time, you can see dips that are uniform in some cases. You can see a big dip around 2009. That's likely because of the global recession that happened that year. That really had an impact on trade in all countries. You can see that again in 2020, and that's going to be because of COVID. There's also another dip around 2016. Not sure exactly what that's about, but that could be worth looking into a little bit more in the future. So then I wanted to look and see if there was a relationship, excuse me, between GDP in each of these countries and total trade. So I imported GDP from the World Bank website, and then I plotted it against total trade volumes. And this scatter plot's not very useful. The outliers really skew the data, and that's going to be China, Canada, Mexico are going to be right here. This is likely China because the large GDP. So I excluded some of the top countries and looked at that again. You can see a bit of a linear relationship between GDP and total trade. But it's hard to make any wider claims. And in the future, I probably should have excluded some of the bottom outliers as well and just looked at that central core group of countries, which may have highlighted a relationship, but I feel like it's unlikely. So then I zoomed in on the UK specifically, and plotted that over time and compared to the graph up here, this total trade graph, which looks like the UK hasn't really increased very much because it's overshadowed by the top three, which have really seen a boom in the last 30 years. The UK still has definitely increased in its trade volumes with the US, and pretty substantially. It's just outpaced by those top three countries, which are kind of skew the visual there. But there's been some notable dips, like I said, 2009, 2020. But there's a steady increase, although it's definitely gotten a bit rockier around 2005. So zooming in even further, I wanted to look at the California-UK trade relationship. So I imported data from the US Census Bureau as well on California-UK trade. The issue with this data is that it doesn't cover services. It only covers goods, commodities. And that's an issue because UK California trade is predominantly made up of services trade. Those are going to be anything from tech companies to financial services, any of that kind of stuff. Those are not hard goods, and they're not going to be included in this data. And I've actually had a really hard time finding any services data at the state level between states and other countries. So if anybody knows where to find that, I'd definitely be interested. That would really help highlight some of the trade differences over time. Anyways, so this was kind of challenging data to work with. There were some columns that were strings that needed to be integers, and then the import and export table were two separate tables, and I needed to combine the import and export values, but that proved really challenging when joining those tables because none of these values were unique, so they couldn't be joined. So I looked to concatenate commodity and time to create a unique column of values, but that proved to be really challenging. So I had some help from Misha and Sean, and was eventually able to concatenate those two values after making essentially a array of rows, array table, or however you would call that, and then creating a for loop and concatenating those values. And only then was I able to join the tables. So it definitely was some challenging real world data to work with. But then, I dove into UK California trade by sector, and I wanted to pick out, well, before that, this is actually another limitation of the data was that it only went back to 2008, the commodities data. So I kind of edited the initial UK US trade graph to just go back to 2008 and see if there are any differences between UK US trade more generally and California UK trade with respect to specific commodities. And I picked out some of the top commodities because I figured those would be the most useful to analyze. As you can see, here's ag products, definitely a different story to tell than this broader UK US trade. Seen a big dip in 2009, steady increases since then, kind of dropped off in 2020. And each of these tables, transportation equipment, is slightly different. So it goes to show that, within each commodity, within each sector, there are huge differences, and those are worth noting. And those have implications both from a policy perspective and from a commercial perspective. If you're a business operating in one of these industries, it's interesting to see how this changes over time. One that I wanted to point out in particular was chemicals, which is a top commodity in trade between California and the UK, and actually has seen steady increases essentially, I mean, apart from this drop off in 2017, but since 2009, and has actually seen an increase through the pandemic, a really sharp increase. So I'd be curious to know what that's about. That may be worth looking into in more detail in the future. Machines, different story as well, not as steady increases, big drop in 2009. But essentially, what I wanted to outline is that, there are noticeable differences within specific sectors when comparing it to UK, US trade more broadly. And those are worth noting and picking out and looking into in more detail. Like I said, it would be great in a future project to maybe look at services data if I could find it, because that would definitely complement this analysis, which is specific to trade and goods. But yeah, that's it. Overall, looking at US trade partners, looking at the outsized importance of those top trade partners, seeing if there's a relationship between GDP and total trade with the US, which it doesn't look like there is, and then zooming in on UK, US trade, and then California, UK trade more specifically. So that's it. Thanks for listening.